Let me begin this debate by saying there is no way to measure the impact of net neutrality being repealed because net neutrality hasn't been repealed yet. So there's no way for me to measure what a negative would be because the repeal hasn't taken place. And I've had this debate many times now, and it seems like the conversation is around the status quo. So I feel like the burden of proof when I talk about a negative is that by ending net neutrality, it will somehow benefit consumers more than the status quo. Because I've had this debate quite a few times. I just haven't heard that yet. My case is I will prove is that data is already cheap. It's unlimited. You're charged for how much you use. And there really isn't a way to make it better than the status quo other than being more open air accessible. So by limiting data, an internet service provider who acts as a middleman steps backwards. I pay my internet service provider for how much data I want to use. I have two plans that both start at $15. Only one charges me for the amount of data. One charges me for the amount of data I want to use at home, the other for how much I use when I'm away. Just as when a company markets me a product, they also pay for bandwidth. So if people on if a lot of people are on Netflix or YouTube, then Netflix or YouTube would just pay for more bandwidth. That's the status quo as it is. So the problem with ending the problem with ending net neutrality is that the internet service provider is the middleman. This creates many problems, including privacy and free speech. But let me begin with this analogy to show how it's gatekeeping. It makes as much sense as an electric company charging for what brand of television I want to use. So I've had this debate a few times now. Tell me how this is better than the status quo.
All right. It kind of sounds like you can see the debate already because you said you can't show the negatives of net neutrality, and that's what the motion is about. I'm not going to show how repealing net neutrality benefits consumers because I wasn't prepared to do that, and that's not what the motion is about. And frankly, there's a bit of a misnomer in the motion because the net neutrality as a principle hasn't been repealed. The FCC was enforcing net neutrality rules before 2015, and they have the authority to enforce them afterwards without ISPs being redefined without the internet being redefined as a public service or anything. So you mentioned we pay for how much data or the speed from our ISP, and then content provider that, and that's really important because lots of people think that the consumers are always going to get shafted, but more realistically, if the ISPs want to charge more, like Netflix, for example, and this is what happened last few years ago, Netflix had to pay Comcast more money, and they did foot the bill, and that didn't affect consumers at all. So luckily, if anybody pays more, are these giant behemoths like Netflix and stuff, and they can afford that. You mentioned privacy and free speech, and I just kind of find that ironic because you're basically arguing to give more power to the FCC, which is the organization that censors free speech right now on TV and radio. So I don't think those are really big issues, and if they are, we should probably keep the internet as far from the FCC as possible. And I think web hosting companies are probably more of a threat to freely available content and stuff because they don't like your website. They can just take off your hosting, which has already happened to politically incorrect like websites and stuff. Yeah, that's basically it.
Let me ask you a question. You're saying the FCC regulates free speech as it is, and am I hearing this right? That you're saying they took down a website? Can you tell me what website that is and a little bit more about that?
Sorry, I guess it wasn't clear enough. The FCC censors free on TV and radio right now. I say as far as content being freely available, people pretend like they're not going to have the content they want or the websites they want to visit. I was just saying that web hosting companies are more of a threat to that than ISPs. I haven't ever heard of an ISP blocking a specific website, but I have heard of web hosting companies dropping websites they don't like.
That goes to my side though, because we're talking about a web hosting company, not the FCC. So I don't think you saying the FCC regulating speech. Sure, they do, but it's not on topic here. It's the internet service provider who would do that. You don't have evidence that they would regulate speech, but you have evidence that would go to my side actually when we talk about free speech, that an internet service provider would censor speech. So that goes to my side. So I think that you've conceded that point. As far as the resolution goes, I haven't heard how it's a positive. Okay, because I've had this debate many times, and usually the argument kind of contradicts itself. I don't want to give that away yet. And when we talk about the history here, it actually goes back to 1996. They wanted to charge schools more. It was actually libertarians and Republicans who were really against this and wanted the legislation back in '96. Because they wanted to charge schools and libraries more, and it just didn't make sense. That's why they said it was a utility, and that's how they got the Title II is today. And I think the best way to illustrate we talk about, because there's many reasons to assume that it's a negative, but what I'm saying is that there's no way to measure it because it hasn't gone into effect yet. And we actually haven't headed in this direction a long time, and we saw it before. So that's why I say it's going backwards, because this just happens to be the exact same thing that happened with satellite companies, with dial-up internet, cable television, telecommunications. It's a step backwards. And let me talk some more about free speech and this free speech issue, because I know that you're interested in that and the privacy issue. The thing is that this makes it a lot harder. If someone can throttle you, it makes it harder to use a proxy, and that's not. So it's harder to use, to route your internet, and it's harder to use a service like Tor. So that's why it's bad for privacy. It just makes it a little more, because we're talking about speed, and with the possibility of speed being slower or somebody not liking what you're doing, that's why that's an issue, because with the privacy thing. And then also what you probably haven't heard about this is that your internet service provider, they can't sell and track what websites you're going to, but now that there's no net neutrality, guess what, they can. So so those are the two privacy things. It makes it harder to use proxy or Tor, and then to the internet service provider, not a website, they can sell your information. So that's why it's bad for privacy. And I think you already conceded the free speech point that a company could censor, which now they can do, they couldn't do before. So that just goes back to me. So I only have about 10 seconds left, so I'll just go ahead and pass it back.
I didn't concede the free speech issue. You mentioned ISPs censoring free speech. I'd like to know an example of that happening, because we know these rules that are being repealed got repealed in mid 2015. So you got a lot of history there to give me some examples of ISPs censoring free speech. So I'd like to hear more about that. You mentioned people raising prices on schools and libraries, and it's interesting you mentioned that, because I actually have I guess I shouldn't call him a friend, a former colleague that owns a small ISP, and this is important because people always just want to talk about Comcast and Time Warner and all these Verizon, all these giants in the industry, but there's over 3,000 ISPs in this country, and a lot of them are little companies like my friend providing internet service to rural areas, and his main business is schools and libraries, and those are the people that you advocating regulating and stuff, not the giants like Comcast. And then you mentioned another if you're throttled, this would be hard. I guess goes back to what I asked before. If you could give me some examples, like I said, you got from the early 90s to 2015, a lot of history to show of things being throttled, and more information about that. So far you haven't given any 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 real negatives at all. And so that's what you're missing here. So I'm going to pass it over. You can try to give me some examples of ISPs censoring free speech.
All of this debate and why I say that it needs to stick to the status quo is that it becomes a debate of ifs when it really isn't, because we're really talking about the status quo. And as I've already said, I just don't know how the status quo is going to get better unless internet was more open in the air. Most people have 2 internet service plans, and they both start at $15. So anyone can afford internet as it is, and that includes everything. So what I'm saying is that I'm not sure. I haven't heard anything from you or anyone I've debated on how this is going to be better. So that's what I'm asking you. And what I'm saying is, in my case, is that the status quo is fine as it is, but I think it could get better if there was more internet in the air, and that's actually where we're headed, and that's why we're having this conversation now, because of 5G. So we're headed toward 5G, but before I step ahead of myself, let me go ahead and reiterate your points. It was your point that you said yourself earlier in this debate that an ISP had censored speech. Am I wrong about that? You said that yourself. I know there's examples of that, but that's not what my case is about. I think you've already conceded that point. I don't think I need to present more evidence because you already said it yourself. As far as your friend owning an ISP, that doesn't mean that it's a good idea or a bad idea at all. So your friend owns an ISP. Thanks for sharing that. As far as, so let's go. So we're talking about ifs. So let's go back to dial-up internet. Let's go back. So with dial-up internet, I don't know. Unfortunately, I remember dial-up internet. So you had like AOL and Comcast, and not Comcast. CompuServe, I always get this confused. But there's only like 2 or 3 services, and they curated the service, and you really couldn't get on the web. I don't know if you remember it at all. It was really lame. And and someone was on CompuServe and you were on AOL, you couldn't talk, you couldn't message them. You had to pay for that service just to talk to people. And so that's why I say it's a step backwards. And as far as like, so cable television, the same thing. It was all open. You just paid a flat fee, and the next thing you know, it's premium channels, and you have to pay more for this channel and the sports package, et cetera, et cetera. The same thing happened especially with satellite television, which was the first thing where it was totally open in the air. And I remember satellite television very well because as I talked about before, my grandfather had one, and you could literally, it was so great. The only thing that was bad about it was that you couldn't, it was just too many channels. And so having a curated service kind of made sense, but at the same time, then all of a sudden you had to pay extra for those channels, and it was all curated around those channels, and you've had to pay more and more for those channels since then. I've never had cable TV. I don't care to have it. So I think, and it was, as far as the telephone industry, now we can do this debate, but before it would probably cost a lot of money just for us to talk on the telephone because it would have been a long distance telephone charges. So that's what you're backpedaling to.
So the status quo here is the lack of these rules. We have 25 years of the internet thriving without net neutrality rules that were passed in 2015. We have 2 years with these rules in place. So we're not, the status quo is on my side, where the internet has thrived and changed lives of millions of people. You mentioned that we want more internet in the air, and I checked out a couple of your other debates and noticed that it was in the comments people mentioned that Google stopped laying fiber when these rules got passed. That definitely doesn't put more internet in the air. So I think the burden is on you to say why these rules are a step forward, not why it's a step back. This is just this is going back to the status quo. So you have 5 unelected people making these sweeping regulations for the entire country. The burden lies on them, on people like you who support it, to why this is better for the country. It's not on us to say, why the status quo should stay the status quo. So I think you're a little mixed up there. I gotta disagree there. I think you mentioned ISPs blocking content. I did not say. Sorry if I don't know, misspoke, but it was not, I did not say ISPs censored people. I said web hosting companies censored people, and web hosting companies are not regulated at all by those 2015 rules. So those were not ISPs. I'm still waiting for you to give me an example of an ISP censoring somebody in the 25 years of internet history before these rules. So yeah, we're still lacking some real negatives here. So I'm going to pass it back.
Well, Verizon, it looks like they censored a abortion group they didn't like. So I think we have an example there, but you're not really answering my argument with that question. So let me go ahead. We'll go back through these points real quick before I do a close. I'm not. The thing is, when you talk about the ISP and free speech, they would be breaking the law. And I do have an example, but they would be breaking the law. So now there's no law. So I think that's the problem with that. Okay. So you talk about laying fiber. The thing is that, did you know that they built more lines since 2015? I think I don't have the number in front of me right now, but it's at least 25, maybe in 50%. I can't, unfortunately, just can't remember. It's in all my other debates. So they built more lines. The only time they built more lines between 2015 and now is actually in 1999. So I think your fiber, and they've actually also, all the companies are still making a profit. So I don't see, you're saying that there's no benefit to my side, but the thing is that there isn't a loss either. And you're absolutely wrong to say that they're not laying fiber. You just named one company and said that this company didn't do it, and Google's against it. And Google's on my side anyway, the company that you named. The truth is, if you measure all of them together, they've laid more fiber than ever since 2015. So you're absolutely wrong about that. The only comparable time is in 1999. So, and the thing is, the internet's been evolving, but I'm saying, yes, you're right to say that it's been evolving, but I'm saying this is going backwards. I'm saying the regulations started in 1996 and that they were just redesigned in 2015. And one thing that we definitely have evidence of is throttling. We've seen it before. They throttle people who use their phone to tether their computer. Verizon does that, and I think it was Comcast. They throttle people who are doing file sharing and that sort of thing. So there is evidence of that. So the thing is, like, with net neutrality, well, do you want to answer that, because we don't have that much time?
Well, I can answer all of it. I don't know what. Is there something specific you wanted me to answer?
Well, go ahead. Yeah, just go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, you said that would be. Hold on, let me read my chicken scratch here. Well, for one, I'm not wrong about what I said about Google not laying fiber. I just mentioned, I did mention one company, but it was a truthful statement. I just said that somebody mentioned that on one of your debates that they stopped laying fiber after the rules were passed, and that's something that you didn't refute at all in the comments, and I was just throwing it out there. So that's a true statement. I'm not wrong about that. You mentioned they're still making profits. Yeah, well, great. Netflix was still making profits when Comcast made them pay more for faster speeds. So, I mean, all these companies are making profits. That's not really the issue. So yeah, let's talk about some of these. You mentioned companies blocking tethering apps and stuff like that. That's not a. I'm not sure that really counts as a free speech issue, but sure, we can. And this goes back to all the rules, net neutrality not actually being repealed, because you had rules before 2015 that were enforced. So in 2005, and Madison River Communications got fined by the FCC because they were blocking voice over IP services, and then Comcast blocked P2P services, and they had to do a $16 million settlement from a class action lawsuit. And then Metro PCS got the FCC stopped them from blocking streaming things, and they've sued the FCC and later abandoned that lawsuit. Another company, 2012, got fined 1.25 million for blocking certain apps. I forgot which company that was. So yeah, these things all happened, and they're all dealt with either by the FCC, absent of these rules you're supporting, or by the free market or public pressure or whatever. So yeah, these things happened, and there still no need for the rules that you're supporting.
So you're telling me now that you don't believe there's a need and this won't do anything?
Yeah, I think I've shown that with I just showed that with all my examples of how this stuff was dealt with before reclassifying the internet.
I'm confused. Is there a benefit to this on your side then? Or is it that it's not going to do anything? I mean, why do anything at all? Why take any action then? I'm confused here.
Okay, like I said, I'm defending what I perceive as the status quo here. I'm defending 25 years of a thriving internet. So I don't believe the burden's on me, but if I was to argue directly against net neutrality, my position now is that they're completely useless and they're unneeded. But I would argue against those just like I'd argue against any regulations, which you've been in debates where before where the argument was basically that it hurts competition, and I would argue that same thing. Our regulations can't really there's not much upside, but there's a lot of downside just because there's a cost of compliance and there's a decrease in competition, which is good for us, the consumer, generally. So that's how I would argue against that, and we can get into that if you like. I don't mind.
Well, when it comes to competition, I don't know what could be worse than for competition than a gatekeeper, especially when you want to measure the little guy against the big guy and who could afford to pay an extra fee to be throttled forward.
Yeah, you mentioned the little guy, but you kind of poo-pooed my example of a little guy ISP, which, by the way, against net neutrality, and he's a little guy. But yeah, so I mean, the gatekeepers is not a net neutrality. That's so yeah. So there's obviously obvious problems with how these giants are treated, but that's not net neutrality. I mean, of course, they get certain benefits and monopolistic power from the government, and that needs to be dealt with. But the answer isn't to pile on more regulation because of problems that regulations cause. The common sense thing would do, we roll back the regulations that cause these competition problems in the first place, and that would be a better solution than passing more regulations.
I think common sense would be the electric company not charging me more for what kind of television I use. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, but that's kind of useless unless you give an example of that actually happening.
How is this any different?
How is the internet different? Well, different from somebody charging you for a specific show. Sorry, clarify your real quick.
I'm saying that if the internet is a utility and a very important utility because it's how we speak, how is charging me for different services that I use better?
It's not necessarily better, and they would I mean, they'd find that out when they tried it and people found new ISPs. I mean, the premise is that, I know there is a lot of people without many choices, but there's even more people that do have choices, and there is competition among ISPs. I have about 5 or so in my town, which isn't a huge city or anything. It's kind of a smaller town, but just at the mere threat of me looking at other providers, my ISP actually doubled my speed and took away my, just because I said I was thinking I didn't really enjoy the service, and I was going to look at other competitors, and that's all it took for them to shape up and get rid of my data cap, which is kind of annoying, honestly. So yeah, so it's not better, and when they do it, they're gonna find that out.
Well, it so happens that since 2015, internet service providers have spent approximately 5% more money than they did before, and 2/3 of the ISPs have increased their capital spending. And I don't have the number in front of me, but I know the majority. Your friend who owns this ISP, great for him. He actually isn't with the majority of small ISPs. Unfortunately, I just can't find that number, but you can look that up as well. Um, so I only have a couple minutes left, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up. I asked my opponent what the benefit compared to the status quo was, and I still haven't heard that. There's no way for me to measure a negative. I can only talk about the status quo and how the status quo could improve. So I've heard two different arguments here. I've heard that a lot of it's been on my side to challenge me, that there would be a negative. I haven't heard. Well, I haven't heard that there would be a positive. I have heard that it wouldn't make any difference. But then I haven't heard, well, why not do anything? I haven't heard why the internet should be different than it is now. And I'm still confused. Like that's because it just doesn't make sense. And if you're somebody, it's because, and then I've talked about privacy. I've talked about how it would be difficult for you to use a proxy, or how it would be difficult for you to use Tor. I haven't heard an answer to that. I've given an example of that Verizon has censored the people because they said something about abortion, that this isn't about the abortion, but some people said things about abortion and Verizon didn't like it and they got censored. So we have seen censorship, and the difference is a law saying the government can't do that. A law saying that you can't censor, and there being no law. All right, and also I said that there's nothing to prevent an ISP from selling your information, your private information, what websites you go to. They can't trace that and sell it now, but now they can. So that's bad for your privacy. So I think that the status quo, an internet that's $15 for everything, I can afford 2 plans, anyone can afford 2 plans, that's fine as it is. The only way for it to be better would be if it was in the air, but we didn't have time for that. And I thank my opponent for his time. Thanks. Have a good night.
So Khan's been saying, how it would do this and how this would be harder and that and the other thing. But he's acting like this is some future state that we're about to go, and it's not. He had 25 years to say this happened and that happened, not this would happen or that would happen, but this happened, this is why it's bad, and this is why it was harmful to consumers and harmful to people and harmful to businesses, harmful to the economy. He had 25 years to point out all the problems that had to have been fixed in mid-2015. It's not on me to say, why should we do this? It was on him to say, why should we have done this 2 years ago? And there was no argument 2 years ago. People had basically the example of the Comcast and Netflix thing, which they both came to an agreement they were both happy with. And so this is just a solution in search of a problem. And so, like I said, he already conceded this debate in the first line, saying he wasn't going to be able to talk about the negatives because it hasn't happened yet. Well, like I said, there was almost the entire history of the internet to talk about the negatives. You mentioned, should respond real quick, the extra money being spent by ISPs. That sounds good and all, but it's kind of lacking context to make it meaningful at all. I mean, you could have been increasing your spending year over year, and it's just another year, and perhaps they could have spent more than before, but still less than they would have otherwise. So without any context, we really can't make much of that data. So again, we haven't heard any net, well, not net, we haven't heard any negatives at all, just reasons why he thinks this could be bad, but absolutely no real examples of negatives here. So vote Khan.